Dice of New Beginnings.
France, 1918.
Clara Whitmore scanned the patient records of wounded soldiers, her breath catching when she saw Lieutenant Daniel Mercer. But that was impossible. Daniel had been reported dead 6 months ago. Hands shaking, she rushed to the ward, only to find the bed empty. The only sign he had been there? A single page torn from a book, left on the pillow. You found me once. Find me again. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Ledger. The air in the records room was thick with the scent of dust and old paper, a familiar comfort to Clara Whitmore. It was a scent that spoke of order, of meticulous cataloging, a world away from the chaos that reigned just beyond the hospital walls. The rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner was the only sound louder than the scratch of her pen as she meticulously transcribed names from the casualty lists onto the crisp, white pages of the hospital ledger. Each name represented a life, a story, often tragically cut short. Clara had learned to approach the task with a detached professionalism, a necessary armor against the relentless tide of grief that threatened to engulf her. But this day, the armor cracked. Her pen froze mid-stroke, hovering over the stark black ink of the M section. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer. The name shimmered on the page, a phantom conjured from the depths of her memory. It couldn't be. Daniel was gone. The telegram had arrived 6 agonizing months ago, stark and brutal in its brevity. Killed in action. No further details available. She had read it 100 times, each reading a fresh wound, until the paper had become softened and worn, a tangible representation of her shattered heart. Clara blinked, forcing herself to focus. Perhaps it was a different Mercer. There must be dozens, hundreds even, scattered throughout the British Expeditionary Force. Yet, her heart, that stubborn, traitorous organ, refused to be silenced. It hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and disbelief. She scanned the entry again. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer, 7th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers. The same regiment, the same rank, the same agonizingly familiar name. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled as she reached for the corresponding patient file. It was thinner than she expected, almost disappointingly so. The details were sparse. Admitted 3 days prior, suffering from shrapnel wounds and severe shell shock. Condition: critical but stable. Current location: Ward C, Ward C. The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. It was the ward for the most severely injured, the men who teetered on the precipice between life and death. The men who often didn't make it. A cold dread, sharper and more immediate than the dull ache of her grief, settled in her stomach. She rose abruptly, the wooden chair scraping against the floor, the sound jarring in the otherwise silent room. The ledger lay open, the name Lieutenant Daniel Mercer staring up at her, a silent accusation, a desperate plea. She had to see for herself. The corridors of the hospital were a labyrinth of hushed activity. Nurses, their faces etched with exhaustion, hurried past, their starched white aprons rustling like the wings of weary angels. The air was heavy with the cloying sweetness of antiseptic, mingled with the underlying, unmistakable stench of blood and decay. Clara navigated the familiar maze, her heart pounding in time with her hurried footsteps. She reached Ward C, the heavy oak door looming before her like a gateway to the underworld. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the cold metal handle. What if it was him? What if it wasn't? Both possibilities were equally terrifying. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The ward was a long, cavernous room, lined with rows of narrow beds. The air was thick with the sounds of suffering, the ragged breathing of men struggling for each breath, the soft moans of pain that escaped even the most stoic lips, the occasional delirious cry that pierced the oppressive silence. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the scene in a stark, unforgiving light. Clara moved slowly down the aisle, her eyes scanning the faces of the men, each one a testament to the brutal reality of war. Bandaged heads, missing limbs, eyes that stared blankly at the ceiling, lost in the private hell of their trauma. She searched for a familiar face, a familiar scar, anything that would confirm the impossible truth that lay before her. She reached the bed where, according to the records, Lieutenant Daniel Mercer should have been. It was empty. The sheets were neatly folded, the pillow plumped, as if waiting for a new occupant. A wave of disappointment, so profound it almost brought her to her knees, washed over her. She had been wrong. It had been a cruel trick of fate, a phantom conjured by her own desperate longing. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell upon a small, almost insignificant detail. On the pillow, nestled amongst the pristine white linen, lay a single page, torn from a book. It was a poem. She recognized it instantly. Tennyson. A passage they had read together countless times, during their stolen moments of peace before the war had ripped them apart. Clara picked it up, her fingers tracing the familiar words. And then, at the bottom of the page, scrawled in a shaky, unfamiliar hand, she saw it. A message, written in pencil, so faint she almost missed it. You found me once. Find me again. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was his handwriting. Changed, distorted by injury and trauma, but undeniably his. He was alive. He was here. And he was waiting for her. But where? Where had he gone? A new kind of fear, a desperate, urgent fear, gripped her. He was hurt, alone, and he needed her. She had to find him. She had to. The empty bed, the torn page, the whispered plea, it was a starting point, a fragile thread of hope in the overwhelming darkness of the war. And Clara, fueled by a love that had defied death itself, was determined to follow it. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Missing. The page felt fragile in Clara's hand, the paper thin and worn, the pencil marks smudged as if written in haste, or perhaps pain. You found me once. Find me again. The words echoed in her mind, a desperate whisper across the chasm of war and loss. He was alive, but where? And why was he not in his assigned bed? The immediate questions hammered at her. Had he been moved? Discharged? Or something worse? Clara shuddered, pushing the darker possibilities away. She needed answers, and she needed them quickly. The ward nurse, a stern-faced woman named Agnes with eyes that had seen too much, was her first recourse. Nurse Agnes, Clara began, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. The patient in bed, the one that was assigned to Lieutenant Mercer. Where is he? Agnes barely glanced up from her charting. Mercer? Discharged this morning. Early release. Doctor's orders. Discharged? Clara's heart sank. But his file said he was critical. He was. Remarkable recovery, though. Dr. Dubois was quite surprised. Said it was a miracle almost. Agnes finally looked at Clara, her gaze sharp and assessing. You knew Lieutenant Mercer, Miss Whitmore? Clara hesitated. Their relationship before the war had been a carefully guarded secret, a stolen romance blossoming in the shadow of her father's disapproval. Daniel, a young officer with no fortune, was not deemed a suitable match for the daughter of a prominent barrister. Their meetings had been clandestine, their letters carefully hidden. Now, in the midst of war, the old societal constraints seemed meaningless, yet the habit of secrecy was hard to break. We were acquainted, Clara finally said, choosing her words carefully. I saw his name in the ledger, and I was concerned. Agnes's expression softened slightly. He seemed a decent sort. Quiet. Kept to himself. Didn't say much about where he was going. Nothing at all? Clara pressed, a desperate edge creeping into her voice. No address? No contact information? Agnes shook her head. Just said he had unfinished business. Seemed in a hurry to be off. Unfinished business. The phrase resonated with Clara, echoing the cryptic message on the torn page. It was a clue, however vague. But what did it mean? Did he leave anything behind? Clara asked, her gaze sweeping the now empty bed, searching for any trace of the man she had thought lost forever. Agnes pointed to a small, battered knapsack tucked beneath the bed. Just that. Standard issue. Nothing of value, I'd imagine. Clara knelt down, her fingers tracing the rough canvas of the knapsack. It was worn and faded, bearing the scars of countless battles. She hesitated for a moment, feeling a pang of guilt at invading his privacy, but the urgency of the situation outweighed her hesitation. She had to find him. She unbuckled the flap and carefully peered inside. The contents were meager: a spare uniform, stained and torn mess tin, dented and blackened by fire, a small, leather-bound book of poetry Tennyson, the same volume the torn page had come from, and a handful of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the handwriting on the top envelope. Her own. Letters she had written to him during their brief, stolen courtship, letters filled with love and longing, letters she had thought lost forever. She carefully untied the ribbon, her fingers trembling. The letters were worn and creased, as if they had been read countless times. She unfolded one, the familiar scent of her lavender perfume rising from the paper, a ghost of a happier past. As she scanned the words, a wave of bittersweet memories washed over her. Their secret meetings in the park, the stolen kisses under the moonlight, the whispered promises of a future that had seemed so bright, so certain. But there was something else. Tucked within the folds of her letter, she found a small, folded piece of paper. It was a map, crudely drawn, of a small village just outside of Amiens. A name was circled: Le Corbeau Noir. The Black Crow. A tavern, perhaps? Or something more. A red X marked a location just outside the village, nestled amongst a cluster of trees. A rendezvous point? A place where he was waiting for her? Or a trap? Clara's mind raced. The map was a tangible clue, a thread leading her closer to Daniel. But it was also a risk. The area around Amiens was still heavily contested, a no-man's land between the Allied and German lines. To venture there would be dangerous, possibly foolish. But the thought of Daniel, alone and injured, waiting for her in that desolate landscape, spurred her on. She couldn't abandon him. Not again. She carefully refolded the map and tucked it back into the letter, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She had a destination, a purpose. She would go to Le Corbeau Noir. She would find Daniel, no matter the cost. The whispers of the missing had become a roar in her ears, a call to action she could no longer ignore. The empty bed was no longer a symbol of loss, but a starting point on a journey fraught with danger, but fueled by a love that refused to die. The war had taken so much from her, but it wouldn't take him. Not this time. Chapter 3. The Torn Page's Plea. The torn page from Tennyson's poems felt like a talisman in Clara's pocket, a fragile link to Daniel and a constant reminder of his plea. You found me once. Find me again. The words were more than just a request, they were a testament to their shared history, a love forged in stolen moments and whispered promises, now tested by the brutal realities of war. She had to be discreet. Leaving the hospital unnoticed, especially during wartime, was no easy feat. Every movement was scrutinized, every absence questioned. Clara, however, had learned to navigate the intricate web of hospital bureaucracy. She had earned the trust of the matron, Mrs. Abernathy, a woman who, beneath her stern exterior, possessed a surprising degree of empathy. Clara fabricated a story about needing to visit a sick aunt in a nearby village, a story she delivered with a carefully crafted blend of urgency and concern. Mrs. Abernathy, after a moment of scrutiny, granted her a 2-day leave, warning her about the dangers of traveling alone and the importance of returning on time. Be careful, Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Abernathy had said, her voice laced with concern. The roads are not safe, especially for a woman traveling alone. And the military police are vigilant. Keep your papers in order and avoid drawing attention to yourself. Clara had nodded, assuring her of her caution. The life felt heavy on her tongue, but it was a necessary deception. She couldn't reveal her true purpose, not to anyone. The risk was too great. Securing transportation was her next challenge. Military vehicles were prioritized for troop movements and supplies, leaving civilians to rely on infrequent trains or the kindness of strangers. Clara, however, had an advantage. Over the years, she had befriended several of the ambulance drivers, men who had witnessed her dedication and compassion firsthand. She sought out Thomas, a young driver with a kind face and a mischievous grin, known for his willingness to bend the rules. She found him in the motor pool, tinkering with the engine of a battered ambulance. "Thomas," she began, keeping her voice low and conspiratorial. "I need a favor." "A big one." Thomas looked up, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "Miss Whitmore? What's this all about?" Clara explained her fabricated story, embellishing it with a few details about her aunt's failing health and the urgency of her visit. She watched his face carefully, gauging his reaction. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then a slow grin spread across his face. "An aunt, you say?
In le Corbeau Noir?
Clara's heart skipped a beat. He knew the village. "You know it?" "Know it? I've driven through it 100 times. Desolate place.
Mostly ruins now."
What would your aunt be doing there?" Clara avoided his question, focusing instead on the opportunity he presented. Could you possibly give me a lift? I'd be eternally grateful." Thomas looked around, making sure they weren't being observed. "It's against regulations, Miss Whitmore. Strictly forbidden. But for you, I'll make an exception. Meet me here at dawn tomorrow. And don't breathe a word of this to anyone." Clara's heart soared with relief.
Dawn.
She had less than 12 hours to prepare. She returned to her small, sparsely furnished room, the torn page clutched tightly in her hand. She studied it again, tracing the lines of the poem, searching for any hidden meaning, any clue that might shed light on Daniel's situation. The passage he had chosen was from The Lady of Shalott, a poem about a woman cursed to live in isolation, weaving a tapestry of the world she could only observe through a mirror. The lines that resonated most with Clara were these: "Out flew the web and floated wide, the mirror cracked from side to side. The curse has come upon me," cried the Lady of Shalott. The curse. Was Daniel referring to the war? To his injuries? Or to something else entirely? The poem spoke of isolation, of a world viewed through a distorted lens. Was Daniel trapped, somehow? Physically or metaphorically? The more she pondered the poem, the more convinced she became that it held a deeper significance. It wasn't just a sentimental choice, it was a message, a cryptic guide to his whereabouts and his state of mind. He was reaching out to her, using the language of poetry to bridge the gap between them, to circumvent the dangers of direct communication. She packed a small bag, including medical supplies, a change of clothes, and the few precious belongings she had managed to salvage from her life before the war. She also included a small, silver locket, a gift from Daniel, containing a miniature portrait of him. It was a tangible reminder of the man she loved, the man she was determined to find. As the hours ticked by, a sense of unease settled over her. She was stepping into the unknown, venturing into a dangerous and unpredictable world. But the torn page, with its whispered plea, gave her strength. It was a promise, a beacon of hope in the darkness. She would find him. She had to. The curse of the war, the curse of separation, would not break them. She would follow the thread of his message, unravel the mystery of his disappearance, and bring him home. The Lady of Shalott had broken her mirror, stepping into the real world, even at the cost of her life. Clara was prepared to do the same. For Daniel, for love, for a future that, against all odds, she still believed in. Chapter 4. Beneath the Weeping Sky. Dawn arrived, cloaked in a thick, gray mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. The air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke. The sky, a canvas of muted grays, seemed to weep a perpetual drizzle, mirroring the somber mood that had settled over Clara. She met Thomas at the appointed hour, her small bag clutched tightly in her hand. He stood beside the battered ambulance, his face etched with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Ready, Miss Whitmore?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clara nodded, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and determination. She climbed into the passenger seat, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of her resolve. The engine sputtered to life, the sound jarring in the pre-dawn stillness. Thomas navigated the deserted streets of the town, the headlights cutting through the mist like glowing eyes. As they left the relative safety of the hospital grounds, a sense of unease settled over Clara. She was stepping into a world beyond the familiar, a world ruled by chaos and uncertainty. The journey was long and arduous. The roads, once smooth and well-maintained, were now scarred by shell craters and littered with debris. They passed through deserted villages, their buildings reduced to rubble, their inhabitants scattered by the winds of war. The landscape was a testament to the brutal reality of the conflict, a stark reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. The silence in the ambulance was punctuated only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional cough from Thomas. Clara stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the desolate landscape. The weeping sky seemed to press down on her, amplifying her sense of isolation and vulnerability. She thought of Daniel, of his message, of the map tucked safely in her bag.
Le corbeau noir.
The black crow. What awaited her there? Was he even still alive? The doubts, which she had tried so hard to suppress, began to creep back in, whispering insidious questions in her ear. Almost there, Miss Whitmore, Thomas said, breaking the silence. Just a few more miles. His words jolted Clara back to the present. She straightened up in her seat, forcing herself to focus on the task ahead. She had to be strong for Daniel. As they approached Le Corbeau Noir, the landscape became even more desolate. The village, or what was left of it, was a cluster of ruined buildings, huddled together like frightened sheep. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a mixture of damp earth, rotting wood, and something else, something acrid and unsettling. Here we are, Thomas said, pulling the ambulance to a stop in front of a building that had once been a tavern. The sign, barely hanging on by a single nail, creaked in the wind.
Le corbeau noir.
The Black Crow. The building was a sorry sight. The windows were shattered, the roof was partially collapsed, and the walls were covered in graffiti, a mixture of French and German slogans. A sense of foreboding washed over Clara as she stepped out of the ambulance. "I'll wait here," Thomas said, his voice low. "But I can't stay long. It's not safe." Clara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." He gave her a small, hesitant smile. "Be careful, Miss Whitmore. This place, it's not what it used to be." Clara watched as he drove away, the ambulance disappearing into the mist like a phantom. She was alone. Alone in a desolate village, surrounded by the ghosts of war, with only a cryptic message and a crudely drawn map to guide her. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She had come this far, she wouldn't turn back now. She walked towards the tavern, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The door, hanging crookedly on its hinges, creaked open as she pushed it. The interior was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and decay. The furniture was overturned, the floor covered in broken glass and debris. A single shaft of light pierced through a hole in the roof, illuminating a dust-covered bar. Clara moved slowly, her senses on high alert. She could hear the scuttling of rats in the walls, the drip, drip, drip of water from the leaking roof. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her own breathing. She searched the tavern, looking for any sign of Daniel, any clue that might lead her to him. She found nothing, just the remnants of a life that had been shattered by war. Then, as she was about to give up, she saw it. Scratched into the dusty surface of the bar, barely visible in the dim light, were two words: cellar.
Below.
The cellar. A hidden space, a place of secrets, a place where someone might be hiding. Her heart quickened with a mixture of hope and fear. She had found another clue, another step closer to Daniel. But what awaited her below? The weeping sky outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, as Clara descended into the darkness, her only guide the faint hope that flickered in her heart, a hope as fragile and as resilient as the torn page she carried. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Abandoned Ward. The cellar door was hidden behind the bar, a heavy wooden slab concealed by a tattered tapestry. Clara pulled the tapestry aside, revealing the dark, gaping maw of the staircase leading down. The air that wafted up from below was cold and damp, carrying the musty scent of earth and something else, something metallic, like old blood. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the rough wood of the door. The darkness below seemed to beckon and repel her at the same time. She was afraid, but the thought of Daniel, possibly injured, possibly waiting for her, spurred her on. She pulled out a small torch from her bag, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. She descended the stairs slowly, carefully, each step creaking under her weight. The air grew colder with each step, the silence more oppressive. The cellar was a large, low-ceilinged room, its walls lined with empty wine racks and broken barrels. The floor was damp and uneven, covered in a layer of dirt and debris. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Clara swept the torch beam across the room, searching for any sign of life. She saw nothing, just the remnants of a once thriving business, now reduced to a tomb. "Daniel?" She called out, her voice echoing in the silence. "Daniel, are you here?" Her only answer was the drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling. She moved further into the cellar, her heart sinking with each step. Had she been wrong? Had she followed a false trail? Was Daniel even alive? Then she saw it. In the far corner of the cellar, hidden behind a stack of broken barrels, a flicker of movement. She rushed towards it, her torch beam focused on the spot. She pushed aside the barrels, revealing a small, huddled figure. It was a man, lying on a makeshift bed of straw and blankets. He was wrapped in a tattered greatcoat, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes closed. He was breathing, but shallowly, unevenly. "Daniel!" Clara cried, dropping to her knees beside him.
He didn't respond.
She gently touched his face, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of his cheekbones, now sharpened by hunger and suffering. His skin was cold, clammy. She checked his pulse. It was weak, thready, but it was there. He was alive. She examined him quickly, carefully. He had a bandage wrapped around his left shoulder, stained with blood. His breathing was labored, suggesting a possible chest wound. He was also suffering from severe malnutrition and dehydration. Clara immediately set to work. She cleaned and rebandaged his shoulder wound, using the supplies she had brought with her. She gave him water, drop by drop, coaxing him to swallow. She covered him with her own coat, trying to warm him. She worked tirelessly, her fear and exhaustion replaced by a fierce determination to keep him alive. She had found him, against all odds. Now, she had to save him. As she worked, she talked to him, whispering words of comfort and encouragement, telling him about her journey, about her love for him, about the future they would have together. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she hoped that her voice, her touch, would reach him, would give him the strength to fight. Hours passed. The only light in the cellar came from her torch, the only sound from her whispered words and Daniel's ragged breathing. The darkness pressed in on her, but she refused to give in to despair. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Daniel stirred. He opened his eyes, his gaze unfocused, confused. "Clara?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here, Daniel," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here." He tried to sit up, but winced in pain. What happened? Where?" "You're safe now," she said, gently pushing him back down. "You're in Le Corbeau Noir, in the cellar of the tavern. I found you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. You came." "Of course, I came," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I told you I would." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the tears that streamed down her cheeks. I thought I was dreaming." "It's not a dream, Daniel," she said. "It's real. I'm here. And I'm not leaving you." He closed his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. I knew you would find me." Clara held his hand, her heart overflowing with love and relief. She had found him. He was alive. And he was safe for now. But the journey was far from over. They were still in a dangerous place, surrounded by enemies. They had to escape, to find a way back to safety. But for now, in the darkness of the abandoned cellar, surrounded by the echoes of the war, they had found each other again. And that was all that mattered. The weeping sky outside seemed to have found a moment of peace, a silent acknowledgement of the love that had defied the odds, a love that had blossomed in the ruins of a broken world. But the silence wouldn't last, and Clara knew their next challenge was just beginning. Chapter 6. The Matron's Secret. The immediate danger was Daniel's condition. While stable for the moment, his wounds and prolonged exposure required proper medical attention, something the cellar of a ruined tavern could not provide. Clara knew she needed to get him back to the hospital, but the journey was perilous, and Thomas was long gone. She considered her options, her mind racing. Returning to the hospital alone with Daniel was out of the question. They would be questioned, possibly detained. The military police were everywhere, and suspicion fell on everyone. She needed help, someone she could trust, someone with resources. And then it struck her, Mrs. Abernathy, the matron. Beneath her stern exterior and strict adherence to rules, Clara had always sensed a hidden depth to the matron, a well of unspoken compassion. There had been small gestures, a knowing look, a shared moment of grief over a lost patient that had hinted at a past shrouded in secrecy. Clara had never pried, respecting the matron's privacy, but now, she had no choice. She decided to risk it. She would return to the hospital, alone, and seek the matron's help. It was a gamble, but it was the only option she could see. Leaving Daniel was agonizing. She made him as comfortable as possible, promising to return quickly. She left him with water, food, and the small silver locket, a tangible reminder of her love and her promise. "I'll be back before dawn," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I promise." Daniel, weak but conscious, nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of trust and apprehension. "Be careful, Clara," he whispered. "Please." The journey back to the hospital was fraught with tension. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Every sound was amplified by the silence of the night. Clara walked quickly, keeping to the back roads, avoiding any contact with soldiers or civilians. She reached the hospital just as the first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the sky. She slipped in through a side entrance, avoiding the main gate and the watchful eyes of the guards. She found Mrs. Abernathy in her office, already at work, poring over reports. The matron looked up, surprised to see Clara standing in the doorway. "Miss Whitmore? What is the meaning of this? You were supposed to be visiting your aunt." Clara closed the door behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mrs. Abernathy, I need your help. Desperately." She told her the truth, everything. About Daniel, about the message, about the cellar, about his condition. She spared no detail, laying bare her heart and her fears. Mrs. Abernathy listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When Clara finished, she remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Clara's shoulder. Then, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "You took a great risk, Miss Whitmore. A foolish one, perhaps." Clara's heart sank. Had she misjudged the matron? Was she going to report her? But then, Mrs. Abernathy continued, her voice softening. "But I understand. Love can make us do foolish things." She rose from her chair and walked over to a small, locked cabinet. She took out a key and opened it, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, Clara saw a collection of maps, medical supplies, and a pistol. Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "Mrs. Abernathy, a spy? A resistance fighter?" The matron saw her look and gave a small, wry smile. "There are things about me, Miss Whitmore, that you do not know. Things I have kept hidden for a long time." She revealed a past that Clara could never have imagined. A past filled with loss, betrayal, and a secret commitment to fighting the enemy from within. She had been working with the French resistance, providing medical aid and intelligence to Allied agents operating behind enemy lines. "Daniel, he's one of them," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "He's been working undercover, gathering information. He was betrayed, that's how he ended up wounded. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Daniel's unfinished business, his cryptic message, his disappearance from the hospital, it all made sense now. Mrs. Abernathy agreed to help. She provided Clara with a detailed map of the area, marking safe routes and hidden checkpoints. She also gave her a small, two-way radio, disguised as a music box, to communicate with her. "We'll use an ambulance," Mrs. Abernathy said. "One that's been modified. It won't be questioned." She looked directly at Clara. "We leave at midnight. There is a contact, a farmer, near Le Corbeau Noir. He will help us get Daniel across the lines, away from immediate danger." Clara felt a surge of relief, mixed with a new sense of awe and respect for the matron. The woman she had known as a strict, unyielding administrator was, in reality, a courageous and resourceful fighter. The hours until midnight crawled by. Clara spent them preparing, gathering supplies, and steeling her nerves. She knew the journey would be even more dangerous this time, but she was no longer alone. She had an ally, a powerful ally, and a plan. The matron's secret had become her lifeline, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The weeping sky outside seemed to have found a new purpose, a steely determination that mirrored Clara's own. The echoes in the abandoned ward were now replaced by the quiet hum of preparation, a symphony of courage and resilience, played out in the shadows of the war. The night held its breath. Chapter 7. A Trail of Breadcrumbs. Midnight arrived, cloaked in a silence, so profound it felt like a physical presence. The hospital was quiet, the only sounds the soft snores of patients and the occasional rustle of a nurse making her rounds. Clara met Mrs. Abernathy in the motor pool, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The modified ambulance was indistinguishable from the others, a testament to the ingenuity of the resistance. Mrs. Abernathy had arranged everything with meticulous care, leaving nothing to chance. She had even forged the necessary paperwork, authorizing a transfer of a critical patient to a specialized facility further behind the lines. "Are you ready, Miss Whitmore?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, her voice low and steady. Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion.
"Yes."
"I am." They climbed into the ambulance, Mrs. Abernathy taking the driver's seat. The engine started smoothly, the sound muffled by the specially designed exhaust system. They drove through the deserted streets, the headlights dimmed, their movements cloaked in secrecy. The journey to Le Corbeau Noir was even more tense than before. They passed several military checkpoints, but Mrs. Abernathy's forged papers and calm demeanor allayed any suspicion. Clara, however, remained on edge, her senses on high alert. As they approached the village, Mrs. Abernathy switched off the headlights, relying on the faint moonlight to guide them. The ruined buildings of Le Corbeau Noir loomed in the darkness, casting eerie shadows that danced like ghosts. They parked the ambulance a short distance from the tavern, hidden amongst a cluster of trees. Mrs. Abernathy handed Clara the disguised radio. "Contact the farmer. His call sign is Hibou. Tell him we are here." Clara turned the crank of the music box, the familiar tune of a French lullaby masking the transmission. She spoke into the small microphone, her voice trembling slightly. "Hibou, this is Rossignol. We are at the rendezvous point. Do you copy?" After a moment of agonizing silence, a crackling voice replied. "Rossignol, this is Hibou. I copy. Proceed to the cellar. I will meet you there." Clara relayed the message to Mrs. Abernathy. They made their way to the tavern, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The cellar door creaked open as they approached, revealing the darkness within. Clara descended the stairs first, her torch illuminating the way. She found Daniel awake, but weak and feverish. He managed a faint smile when he saw her. "You came back," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I told you I would," Clara said, her voice choked with emotion. She quickly explained the situation, introducing Mrs. Abernathy as an ally. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly understood. He had worked with the matron before during his undercover missions. He knew her reputation, her courage, her resourcefulness. Suddenly, a gruff voice interrupted them. Rossignol? A man emerged from the shadows, his face weathered and lined, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He was dressed in rough farmer's clothes, but his bearing suggested a man of authority. Hibou? Clara asked. The man nodded. I am Jean-Luc. The matron sent you? Yes, Clara replied. We need to get him out of here. He's badly injured. Jean-Luc examined Daniel quickly, his experienced eye assessing his condition. He needs a doctor. But we can't risk the hospital. Not yet.
He explained his plan.
He had a safe house, a small, isolated farm a few miles away, where Daniel could receive basic medical care and rest. He would then arrange for his transport across the lines, to a place where he could be properly treated and recover. It was a risky plan, but it was their best hope. They carefully lifted Daniel, supporting his weight between them. He winced in pain, but he didn't complain. They carried him out of the cellar into the waiting ambulance. The journey to the farm was slow and arduous. They drove along narrow, winding roads, avoiding the main thoroughfares. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first rays of dawn painting the horizon with streaks of pink and orange. They reached the farm just as the sun was rising. It was a small, unassuming place, nestled amongst rolling hills and fields of wheat. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, a sign of life and warmth. Jean-Luc's wife, Marie, greeted them at the door. She was a kind-faced woman, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and compassion. She quickly prepared a bed for Daniel in a small, clean room at the back of the house. Clara and Mrs. Abernathy helped Daniel into bed, making him as comfortable as possible. Marie brought warm broth and bread, coaxing him to eat. As Clara watched Daniel, a sense of relief washed over her.
He was safe for now.
He was surrounded by people who cared for him, people who were willing to risk their lives to help him. But the journey was far from over. They were still in enemy territory, still vulnerable. They had to remain vigilant, to trust in each other, to follow the trail of breadcrumbs that Jean-Luc and Mrs. Abernathy had laid out for them. The weeping sky had given way to a clear, bright dawn, but the shadows of war still lingered. The echoes in the abandoned ward were now replaced by the quiet sounds of the farm, a symphony of hope and resilience, played out against the backdrop of a world still engulfed in conflict. But a new, unexpected breadcrumb would soon present itself. Chapter 8. The Spy Among Us. The relative peace of Jean-Luc's farm was a fragile illusion. While Daniel began to show slight signs of improvement under Marie's care and Clara's constant attention, the underlying tension remained. They were still behind enemy lines, every moment a gamble. The radio, disguised as a music box, was their only link to the outside world, a lifeline that could be severed at any moment. Mrs. Abernathy, ever vigilant, maintained a strict schedule of communication with her contacts, exchanging coded messages that spoke of troop movements, supply routes, and hidden dangers. It was during one of these exchanges that a new, unsettling piece of information emerged. There's a leak, Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice grim, after a particularly long session with the radio. Someone within our network is feeding information to the Germans. Clara's blood ran cold. A spy? Among them? The thought was terrifying. It meant that their every move, their every plan could be compromised. It meant that Daniel's life, and their own, were in even greater danger. Who? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. How do they know? Mrs. Abernathy shook her head. They don't know for sure. But there have been incidents. Raids on safe houses, ambushes on supply convoys, arrests of key operatives. Too many to be coincidences. The circle of trust, already small, had suddenly shrunk. Suspicion fell on everyone. Even Jean-Luc and Marie, who had risked their lives to shelter them, could not be entirely excluded. Daniel, weak but increasingly alert, listened to their conversation with growing concern. It has to be someone with access to information, he said, his voice hoarse. Someone who knows our movements, our plans. They began to analyze their situation, dissecting every detail, searching for any clue that might point to the traitor. They reviewed the events leading up to Daniel's injury, his mission, his contacts. They examined the information that had been leaked, trying to identify a pattern, a connection. Clara, with her intimate knowledge of the hospital, focused on the events surrounding Daniel's supposed discharge. The early release, the doctor's surprise, the lack of any follow-up, it all seemed suspicious in retrospect. Dr. Du Bois, she said, suddenly. He was the one who authorized Daniel's release. He said it was a miracle. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes narrowed. Du Bois, I know him. He's a respected physician, but he's also known for his gambling debts. He's always in need of money. A chill ran down Clara's spine. Could it be? Could a man of medicine, a man sworn to heal, be a traitor? They decided to investigate discreetly. Mrs. Abernathy used her contacts to gather information about Du Bois, his finances, his associates, his movements. Clara, meanwhile, focused on the hospital records, searching for any anomalies, any inconsistencies that might confirm their suspicions. She spent hours poring over the ledgers, the patient files, the duty rosters. She discovered that Du Bois had been on duty the night Daniel was admitted, and that he had personally overseen his care. She also found that he had made several unexplained trips to Amiens in the weeks leading up to Daniel's injury. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was mounting. It was enough to convince Mrs. Abernathy that Du Bois was, at the very least, a person of interest. They decided to confront him, but they had to be careful. A direct accusation could be dangerous, especially if they were wrong. They needed proof, something concrete that would tie him to the leaks. They devised a plan. Clara would return to the hospital, ostensibly to resume her duties. She would use her access to the records and her familiarity with the staff to gather more information about Du Bois, to observe his movements, to listen for any whispers of his involvement. It was a risky plan, but it was their best chance to uncover the truth. Clara knew that she was walking into a dangerous situation, that she could be exposing herself to the enemy. But she was determined to do whatever it took to protect Daniel, to expose the traitor, to bring justice to those who had been betrayed. As she prepared to leave the farm, Daniel held her hand, his eyes filled with concern. "Be careful, Clara," he whispered.
Please.
"I couldn't bear to lose you again." "I'll be careful," she promised, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll come back. I always will." The weeping sky had returned, casting a pall over the landscape. The echoes of the farm were now replaced by the quiet hum of deception, a symphony of suspicion and betrayal, played out in the shadows of the war. Clara walked into the lion's den. A trail of seemingly innocuous breadcrumbs had revealed something rotten and deeply dangerous at the heart of their refuge. Chapter 9. Letters from a dead man returning to the hospital felt like stepping back into a different life. The familiar smells of antiseptic and sickness, the hushed whispers of nurses, the constant undercurrent of pain and suffering, it was all so familiar, yet so different now. Clara saw everything through a new lens, a lens of suspicion and fear. She resumed her duties, outwardly calm and composed, but inwardly on high alert. She observed Dr. Du Bois carefully, watching his movements, listening to his conversations, searching for any sign of his guilt. He seemed unchanged, outwardly the same respected physician he had always been. He was polite, efficient, and seemingly dedicated to his patients. But Clara noticed subtle changes, small details that she might have overlooked before. He was more nervous than usual, his hands trembled slightly, and he avoided direct eye contact. He also seemed to be spending an unusual amount of time in his office, behind closed doors. Clara used her access to the records to investigate further. She discovered that Du Bois had been making frequent, unexplained changes to patient files, altering diagnoses and treatments. She also found that he had been receiving large sums of money, deposited into a secret bank account in Amiens. The evidence was mounting, but it still wasn't enough. She needed something concrete, something that would definitively link him to the leaks. Then she remembered something. During her initial search of Daniel's belongings, she had found a bundle of letters she had written to him before the war. She had focused on the map, the clue to his location, and had overlooked the potential significance of the letters themselves. She retrieved the letters from her room, her heart pounding with anticipation. She carefully unfolded each one, scanning the familiar words, searching for anything that might be relevant. And then she found it. In one of her letters, written months before Daniel's injury, she had mentioned a conversation she had overheard between two officers, discussing a planned offensive. She had dismissed it at the time as idle gossip, but now, in light of the recent events, it took on a new significance. The offensive she had mentioned had been a disaster, a complete failure. The Germans had been waiting for them, ambushing the Allied troops and inflicting heavy casualties. The information she had inadvertently revealed in her letter had been leaked, leading to the deaths of countless soldiers. And the officer who had been responsible for planning the offensive? Lieutenant Daniel Mercer. Clara's blood ran cold. She had unwittingly provided the information that had led to Daniel's betrayal, to his injury, to his near death. She had been the leak, the unwitting instrument of his downfall. But how had Dubois gotten hold of her letter? She remembered Daniel telling her that he had kept her letters with him, a reminder of their love, a source of comfort in the midst of war. He had been carrying them when he was injured, when he was brought to the hospital. And Dubois had been the one who had treated him, the one who had access to his belongings. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Dubois had found her letter, recognized the significance of the information, and sold it to the Germans. He had used her words, her love for Daniel, to betray them both. Clara felt a surge of anger, of betrayal, of guilt. She had been so naive, so careless. She had trusted Dubois, and he had used her trust to destroy everything she held dear. But there was no time for self-pity. She had to act, to expose Dubois, to clear Daniel's name, to avenge the soldiers who had died because of her unwitting betrayal. She decided to confront Dubois, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed proof, something that would definitively link him to the letters, to the leaks. She remembered the matron's secret compartment, the pistol hidden inside. She knew it was a risk, but she had no choice. She would use the pistol to force Dubois to confess, to reveal his treachery. She made the dangerous choice to go to Mrs. Abernathy's office. The hospital was quiet, the night shift just beginning. She slipped into the matron's office, her heart pounding in her chest, and took the weapon. The weeping sky outside seemed to mirror her own turmoil. The echoes of the hospital were now replaced by the quiet click of the pistol's safety, a symphony of desperation and resolve, played out in the shadows of the war. The letters from a dead man, a man she had brought back to life, had revealed a truth more devastating than she could have imagined. The trail had led her back to herself and to a horrifying choice. Chapter 10. The Rendezvous Point. Clara found Dr. Dubois in his office, poring over papers under the dim glow of a desk lamp. He looked up, startled, as she entered without knocking, the pistol concealed beneath her shawl. "Miss Whitmore?" he said, his voice laced with surprise and a hint of apprehension. "What is the meaning of this?" Clara closed the door behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to talk, Doctor. About Lieutenant Mercer. About the letters." Dubois's face paled. He tried to maintain his composure, but a flicker of fear crossed his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." Clara stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "Don't lie to me, Doctor. I know about the money. I know about the altered records. And I know about the letters." She revealed the letter, her letter, the one containing the information about the offensive. She held it up, the incriminating words clearly visible in the lamplight. "You found this among Lieutenant Mercer's belongings, didn't you?" she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You recognized the significance of the information, and you sold it to the Germans. You betrayed him. You betrayed us all." Dubois's facade of innocence crumbled. He slumped back in his chair, his face a mask of guilt and despair. How did you know?" "It doesn't matter," Clara said. "What matters is that you confess, that you tell the truth." Dubois hesitated for a moment, then, with a sigh of resignation, he began to speak. He told her everything. About his gambling debts, about his desperate need for money, about his contact with a German agent in Amiens. He confessed to stealing the letter, to selling the information, to betraying his country and his oath. As he spoke, Clara felt a mixture of disgust and pity. He was a weak man, a broken man, a man who had succumbed to temptation and greed. But he was also a man who had caused immense suffering, a man who had blood on his hands. "I need you to write a confession," Clara said, her voice firm. "A full confession, detailing everything you've done. And then you're going to turn yourself in." Du Bois looked at her, his eyes filled with despair. "It's over, isn't it?" "Yes," Clara said. "It's over." He wrote the confession, his hand trembling as he signed his name. It was a damning document, a testament to his treachery and his guilt. Clara took the confession, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done. She had exposed Du Bois, but she had also exposed her own unwitting role in the tragedy. She had brought justice, but at a great personal cost. She left Du Bois in his office, the confession lying on his desk like a death sentence. She knew he would be arrested, tried, and most likely executed. It was a harsh fate, but it was the price of his betrayal. Clara went to find a secure line, away from the prying ears in the hospital. She needed to contact Mrs. Abernathy and relay the news that she was coming back with Du Bois's confession. But she also needed a plan, a way out for both of them. Thinking fast, remembering the coded communications and rendezvous points she had overheard during previous conversations, Clara composed the transmission that would signal their next steps. Using a public phone and a prearranged code, she made the quick, cryptic call. "The Black Crow has sung its last song. Meet at the Weeping Willow, dawn. Bring the lullaby." The Weeping Willow. It was a secluded spot a few miles outside of Amiens, a place where the resistance often held secret meetings. It was their rendezvous point, a place where they could regroup, plan their next move, and hopefully escape. The lullaby was the ambulance. As Clara waited, she went through the range of emotions. The confession was a victory, but one with devastating implications. It was the first step toward clearing Daniel's name, getting him the safety he deserved. But it was the start of something else, too. Something more frightening. She had exposed a traitor, but she had also exposed herself. She was no longer just a nurse, a caregiver. She was a player in a dangerous game. A game of espionage and betrayal, a game where the stakes were life and death. She was now fully aware of the danger. The weeping sky had cleared, revealing a sliver of moon in the inky blackness. The echoes of the hospital were now replaced by the quiet hum of anticipation, a symphony of hope and fear, played out in the shadows of the war. The rendezvous point was set and the clock ticking. Chapter 11. Reunion in the Ruins. Dawn broke gray and misty, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Clara, with Du Bois's confession tucked securely in her bag, waited by the weeping willow, a solitary figure in a landscape of desolate beauty. The tree, its branches draped like mournful arms, stood sentinel over a small, overgrown cemetery, a silent testament to the ravages of war. She had left the hospital before sunrise, slipping away unnoticed, leaving behind a note for a trusted colleague, explaining her absence with a fabricated emergency. She had taken a circuitous route, avoiding the main roads, her senses on high alert for any sign of pursuit. The wait was agonizing. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound, sent a jolt of fear through her. She scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the ambulance, of Mrs. Abernathy, of hope. Finally, in the distance, she saw it. The familiar shape of the ambulance, its headlights cutting through the mist like glowing eyes. It approached slowly, cautiously, stopping a short distance from the tree. Mrs. Abernathy emerged, her face etched with concern. "Clara, are you all right?" Clara nodded, relief washing over her. "Yes, I have it. The confession." She handed Mrs. Abernathy the document, explaining everything that had happened, the confrontation, the confession, the exposure of her own unwitting role. Mrs. Abernathy listened in silence, her expression grim. "You took a great risk, Clara, but you did what you had to do." She examined the confession, her eyes scanning the damning words. "This will change everything. It will clear Daniel's name, and it will expose Du Bois's network." But there was no time for celebration. They were still in danger, still exposed. They had to get to Daniel, to get him to safety, to escape before Dubois's allies discovered his betrayal. They drove to Jean-Luc's farm, the ambulance bouncing along the rutted roads. The sky was beginning to lighten, the mist slowly dissipating. They reached the farm just as the sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the fields of wheat. Jean-Luc and Marie greeted them at the door, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had been expecting them, alerted by a coded message from Mrs. Abernathy. Daniel was awake, sitting up in bed, his face still pale and gaunt, but his eyes filled with a spark of hope. When he saw Clara, a smile spread across his face. "You came back," he whispered, his voice weak, but filled with emotion. Clara rushed to his side, kneeling beside the bed, taking his hand in hers. "I told you I would," she said, her voice choked with tears. She told him everything about Dubois, about the confession, about the plan to get him to safety. Daniel listened in silence, his grip tightening on her hand. "You saved me, Clara," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved my life, my honor." "We saved each other," Clara said, her heart overflowing with love. But there was no time for sentimentality. They had to leave, quickly. Jean-Luc had arranged for a transport, a small, unmarked truck that would take them across the lines, to a British-controlled area. They carefully helped Daniel into the ambulance, making him as comfortable as possible. Mrs. Abernathy would drive, with Clara by her side. Jean-Luc and Marie would stay behind, risking their lives to cover their escape. As they prepared to leave, Daniel stopped them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, silver locket, the one containing his miniature portrait. He handed it to Clara. "Keep this," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "As a promise. A promise that we will be together again, when this war is over." Clara took the locket, her fingers closing around it tightly. "I will," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I promise." They climbed into the ambulance, the engine starting with a roar. They drove away from the farm, leaving behind the only sanctuary they had known, heading towards an uncertain future. The weeping sky had cleared, revealing a bright, blue expanse. The echoes of the farm were now replaced by the rumble of the engine, a symphony of hope and fear, played out against the backdrop of a world still at war. The reunion in the ruins had been brief, bittersweet, but it had reaffirmed their love, their commitment to each other. They were together for now, and they would face whatever came next together. The road ahead was long and dangerous, but they were not alone. They had each other, and they had a promise of a future beyond the war, a future where they could finally be together, in peace. Chapter 12. The weight of his return. The truck, driven by a stoic, silent resistance fighter named Pierre, bumped along the treacherous roads, each jolt sending a wave of pain through Daniel's injured body. Clara, sitting beside him, held his hand tightly, offering what comfort she could. Mrs. Abernathy sat in the front, her eyes constantly scanning the road, her hand never far from the hidden pistol. The journey was a nerve-wracking game of cat and mouse. They avoided main roads, sticking to narrow, winding tracks, often little more than dirt paths. They passed through deserted villages, their buildings scarred by shellfire, their inhabitants long gone. The landscape was a constant reminder of the brutal reality of the war, a stark contrast to the fragile hope that flickered within their small group. They encountered several checkpoints, manned by wary soldiers, but Pierre's forged papers and Mrs. Abernathy's calm authority saw them through. Each encounter, however, left them shaken, the threat of discovery ever present. As they neared the front lines, the sounds of war became more intense. The distant rumble of artillery, the crackle of gunfire, the occasional roar of an airplane overhead, it was a constant reminder of the violence that surrounded them. Daniel, despite his pain, remained remarkably calm. He had been through so much, had faced death so many times, that he seemed to have developed an almost preternatural acceptance of danger. But Clara noticed the subtle signs of his anxiety, the slight tremor in his hand, the way he clenched his jaw, the haunted look in his eyes. "It's all right, Daniel," she whispered, leaning closer to him. We're almost there. We're going to make it. He managed a weak smile. I know, he said. I trust you. His words, simple as they were, filled Clara with a profound sense of responsibility. She had brought him back from the brink of death, had exposed a traitor, had risked her own life to save him. But the weight of his return, the burden of his safety, now rested squarely on her shoulders. They finally reached the British lines under the cover of darkness. Pierre stopped the truck a short distance from a designated crossing point, a small, heavily guarded bridge over a narrow river. He gave them final instructions, pointing out the landmarks they needed to follow, warning them about the patrols. Good luck, he said, his voice gruff but filled with a hint of warmth. May God be with you. Clara, Mrs. Abernathy, and Daniel climbed out of the truck, their bodies stiff and aching from the long journey. They made their way towards the bridge, keeping to the shadows, their senses on high alert. The crossing was fraught with tension. The bridge was illuminated by searchlights, and soldiers patrolled both sides, their rifles at the ready. They had to time their movements carefully, waiting for the opportune moment to slip across unnoticed. Mrs. Abernathy took the lead, her forged papers clutched in her hand. She approached the guards, her demeanor calm and confident, explaining that she was transferring a critically injured officer to a field hospital on the other side. Clara and Daniel followed closely behind, their hearts pounding in their chests. The guards scrutinized their papers, their faces suspicious. Clara held her breath, praying that they wouldn't be discovered. After what seemed like an eternity, the guards nodded, allowing them to pass. They crossed the bridge, stepping onto British-controlled territory, their relief almost palpable. But their journey wasn't over yet. They still had to reach the field hospital to get Daniel the medical attention he needed. They walked for another hour, following a narrow, muddy path, the sounds of war gradually fading behind them. They finally reached the hospital, a sprawling complex of tents and makeshift buildings, bustling with activity. Nurses and doctors rushed around, tending to the wounded, their faces etched with exhaustion and determination. Daniel was immediately taken into care, his condition assessed, his wounds treated. Clara and Mrs. Abernathy waited anxiously, their bodies weary, their minds racing. After what seemed like an eternity, a doctor emerged, his face grim.
He's stable, he said.
But he's lost a lot of blood. He needs rest and extensive rehabilitation. Clara's heart sank. She had hoped for a more positive prognosis, a quicker recovery. But she knew that Daniel's injuries were severe, that his journey back to health would be long and arduous. The doctor looked at both of them and spoke. He's asking for Miss Whitmore. Clara and Mrs. Abernathy exchanged a look. It seemed they still had a few hurdles, but for now, Daniel's survival was their priority. The weight of his return was heavy, but it was a weight Clara was willing to bear. She had brought him this far, and she would not abandon him now. The weeping sky had given way to a star-filled night. The echoes of the war were now replaced by the quiet hum of the hospital, a symphony of hope and healing, played out against the backdrop of a world slowly beginning to recover. But the weight remained. It was etched on their faces, and in Daniel's tired, grateful eyes when Clara finally sat at his bedside. Chapter 13. Scars of the Soul. The field hospital was a world of controlled chaos, a constant influx of wounded soldiers, the air thick with the smells of antiseptic, blood, and sweat. Daniel, though stable, was confined to a small, cramped cot, surrounded by other men suffering the ravages of war. His physical wounds were slowly healing, but the scars of his soul, the trauma he had endured, were far deeper and more resistant to treatment. Clara visited him every day, her presence a beacon of hope and normalcy in the midst of the surrounding suffering. She brought him news from the outside world, read to him from his beloved Tennyson, and simply sat with him, holding his hand, offering silent comfort. But she noticed the changes in him. He was withdrawn, often lost in his own thoughts, his eyes haunted by memories he couldn't or wouldn't share. He rarely spoke about his experiences, about his time undercover, about the betrayal that had nearly cost him his life. Clara understood. She knew that the trauma of war could leave invisible scars, wounds that festered beneath the surface, poisoning the mind and spirit. She tried to be patient, to be understanding, but she longed for the man he had been before, the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had shared her dreams of a future filled with peace and happiness. One afternoon, as she sat beside his bed, reading aloud from the Lady of Shalott, he suddenly interrupted her. "Don't," he said, his voice hoarse. I can't listen to that anymore." Clara closed the book, her heart aching. She knew the poem held a special significance for them, a reminder of their shared past, of his cryptic message. But now, it seemed to be a source of pain, a trigger for memories he couldn't bear to face.
"Daniel," she said softly.
"What is it? What's wrong?" He turned his head away, staring at the blank wall of the tent. It's all too much," he whispered. "The memories, the faces, the guilt."
Guilt.
The word hung in the air between them, a heavy weight. Clara knew that he blamed himself for the failure of the offensive, for the deaths of the soldiers under his command. He felt responsible, even though he had been betrayed, even though he had nearly died himself. "It wasn't your fault, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You were betrayed. You were a victim." He shook his head. "I should have known.
I should have seen it coming.
I was too trusting, too naive." Clara reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "You were brave," she said. "You risked your life for your country, for what you believed in. That's not naivete, that's courage." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "You don't understand, Clara," he said. "You don't know what I've done, what I've seen." "Then tell me," she said. "Let me help you carry the burden. Let me share your pain." He hesitated for a moment, then, slowly, haltingly, he began to speak. He told her about his time undercover, about the constant fear, the deception, the betrayal. He spoke of the faces of the men he had befriended, the men who had trusted him, the men who had died because of the information he had unwittingly revealed. As he spoke, Clara listened, her heart breaking for him. She held his hand tightly, offering silent support, letting him know that she was there for him, that she would not judge him, that she would love him no matter what. The confession was cathartic. As he unburdened himself, a weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. The haunted look in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Clara," he said when he had finished. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for not turning away." "I will never turn away from you, Daniel," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Never." They sat in silence for a long time, their hands clasped together, their hearts connected. The scars of his soul were still there, but they were beginning to heal. The weight of his past was still heavy, but he was no longer carrying it alone. The weeping sky had given way to a gentle rain, washing away the dust and grime of the war. The echoes of the hospital were now replaced by the quiet rhythm of their shared breathing, a symphony of healing and forgiveness, played out against the backdrop of a world slowly beginning to mend. But the scars, both visible and invisible, served as a constant reminder of the cost of war, a cost that they would both carry for the rest of their lives. The path to healing was long, but they were walking it together. Chapter 14. Forbidden Embrace. The slow, steady rhythm of recovery was a stark contrast to the frantic pace of their escape. Daniel's physical wounds were healing, his strength gradually returning, but the emotional scars lingered, casting a shadow over their reunion. Clara remained his constant companion, her presence a soothing balm on his troubled soul. The hospital, however, was not a place for romance. The constant presence of other patients, the watchful eyes of nurses, the ever-present reminders of suffering and loss, created an atmosphere of enforced restraint. Their conversations were hushed, their touches fleeting, their longing for intimacy a constant, unspoken ache. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Clara found Daniel sitting outside his tent, staring at the setting sun. He looked lost, his eyes filled with a sadness that pierced her heart. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching, the warmth of his body a comforting presence. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the colors of the sky shift and fade, the world around them slowly darkening. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Clara said softly, breaking the silence. Daniel nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "It reminds me of before," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Before the war. Before everything changed." Clara knew what he meant. Before the war, their lives had been filled with simple pleasures, with stolen moments of joy, with the promise of a future together. Now, that future seemed distant, uncertain, clouded by the shadows of their shared trauma. "It will be beautiful again, Daniel," she said, her voice filled with a conviction she wasn't entirely sure she felt. "We'll make it beautiful again." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you really believe that, Clara?" he asked. "After everything we've been through? After everything we've lost?" "I have to believe it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If I don't believe it, then what's the point?" He reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the lines of her cheek, his touch gentle, hesitant. "You're so strong, Clara," he said. "So much stronger than I am." "We're strong together, Daniel," she said, her heart aching with love for him. "We always have been." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her skin. She closed her eyes, her senses filled with the scent of him, the feel of him, the longing for him. Their lips met, a tentative touch at first, then deepening into a passionate embrace. It was a kiss filled with longing, with relief, with the desperate need to reconnect, to reaffirm their love in the face of overwhelming loss. It was a forbidden embrace, a stolen moment of intimacy in a place where such things were not allowed. But they didn't care. They had been through too much, had lost too much, to deny themselves this small measure of comfort, this reaffirmation of their bond. The kiss was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. They broke apart, startled, their faces flushed with a mixture of guilt and desire. A nurse walked past, her gaze averted, pretending not to have seen them. They looked at each other, a shared understanding passing between them. They couldn't stay here. They needed to be alone, to have time to heal, to rebuild their relationship, to rediscover the intimacy that had been stolen from them by the war. "I need to get away from here, Clara," Daniel said, his voice urgent. I need to be with you. Alone." Clara understood. She felt the same longing, the same need to escape the confines of the hospital, to find a place where they could be themselves, where they could be together, without the constant reminders of the war. They began to make plans discreetly, carefully. Mrs. Abernathy, who had been a silent observer of their growing closeness, offered her help. She had connections, resources, a network of safe houses that could provide them with the privacy they needed. She arranged for Daniel to be officially discharged from the hospital, citing his remarkable recovery. She then secured a small, secluded cottage in the countryside, far from the front lines, far from the reminders of the war. It was a risky plan, but it was their only chance for happiness, for healing, for a future together. They knew that they were breaking the rules, that they were defying the expectations of society, but they didn't care. They had earned their right to happiness, to love, to a life free from the shadows of the war. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Clara looked back at the sprawling complex of tents, at the constant stream of wounded soldiers, at the faces of the nurses and doctors who had become so familiar to her. She felt a pang of guilt, a sense of leaving behind a world that had defined her for so long. But then she looked at Daniel, at the hope in his eyes, at the love that shone through his scars, and she knew that she was making the right decision. She was choosing love, choosing happiness, choosing a future that, against all odds, she still believed in. The weeping sky had given way to a clear, bright moon, illuminating their path. The echoes of the hospital were now replaced by the quiet rustle of the wind in the trees, a symphony of freedom and desire, played out against the backdrop of a world slowly beginning to heal. The forbidden embrace had ignited a spark, a flame of hope that would guide them through the darkness, towards a future they would build together, a future where love, not war, would define their lives. Chapter 15. The Enemy Within. The cottage, nestled in a secluded valley surrounded by rolling hills and fields of wildflowers, was a sanctuary, a world away from the chaos and suffering of the war. It was small, rustic, but filled with a sense of peace and tranquility that Clara and Daniel had not known for years. They spent their days exploring the countryside, walking hand in hand through the fields, picnicking by a stream, rediscovering the simple pleasures of life that had been stolen from them by the war. They talked, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and memories, slowly rebuilding the intimacy that had been shattered by trauma and separation. They made love, tentatively at first, then with growing passion, their bodies rediscovering the rhythm of their love, their souls reaffirming their bond. It was a healing process, a way of reclaiming their lives, of asserting their love in the face of overwhelming loss. But the shadows of the war were never far away. Daniel still suffered from nightmares, his sleep often interrupted by vivid flashbacks of his time under cover, of the betrayal, of the violence he had witnessed. Clara would hold him close, whispering words of comfort, soothing his troubled mind, helping him to return to the present, to the safety of their sanctuary. They also knew that their escape was not without its risks. Mrs. Abernathy had warned them that Du Bois's allies might still be searching for Daniel, seeking revenge for his betrayal. They had to remain vigilant, to keep their location a secret, to avoid drawing attention to themselves. One afternoon, as they were returning from a walk, they noticed a strange car parked on the road near their cottage. It was a military vehicle, a type they had not seen before. Their hearts quickened with fear. Had they been discovered? They approached cautiously, hiding behind a hedge, observing the car. Two men emerged, dressed in civilian clothes, but their bearing, their demeanor, suggested they were soldiers. They looked around, their eyes scanning the landscape, their hands never far from their waists, where Clara suspected they concealed weapons. Daniel recognized one of the men. It was a German officer, a man he had known during his undercover mission, a man he had considered a friend, a man who had ultimately betrayed him. "It's Schmidt," Daniel whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and anger. "He's one of them. He's the one who—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. Schmidt was the one who had orchestrated Daniel's betrayal, the one who had nearly killed him. They watched as the men approached the cottage, their intentions clear. They were searching for Daniel, seeking revenge. Clara and Daniel knew they had to act quickly. They couldn't stay here. They had to escape, to disappear before Schmidt and his companion found them. They slipped away, unnoticed, running through the fields, their hearts pounding in their chests. They headed towards a nearby forest, hoping to find cover, to lose their pursuers. They ran for what seemed like an eternity, their lungs burning, their legs aching. They could hear the men shouting behind them, their voices growing closer. They reached the forest, plunging into the dense undergrowth, their bodies scratched and bleeding from the thorns and branches. They kept running, deeper and deeper into the woods, until they could no longer hear the sounds of pursuit. They collapsed, exhausted, at the base of a large oak tree, their bodies trembling with fear and exertion. They were safe for now, but they were lost, alone, and hunted. The enemy was not just across the front lines, the enemy was within, closer than they had ever imagined. The sanctuary had been shattered, their peace destroyed. They were once again on the run, fugitives in a world torn apart by war. The weeping sky had returned, casting a pall over the landscape. The echoes of the cottage were now replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant shouts of their pursuers, a symphony of fear and desperation, played out against the backdrop of a world still at war. They had found a moment of peace, but now, the reality of their situation, hunted, alone, and constantly in danger, had crashed down. The forbidden embrace seemed like a lifetime ago. Chapter 16. A desperate gamble. Lost and hunted in the dense forest, Clara and Daniel knew they had to find a way to contact Mrs. Abernathy, to alert her to their situation, to seek her help. But they had no radio, no means of communication, and they were miles from any known safe house. They decided to head towards the nearest village, hoping to find a telephone, a telegraph, any way to send a message. It was a risky plan, exposing them to potential capture, but they had no other choice. They traveled by night, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main roads. They foraged for food, eating berries and roots, their bodies growing weaker with each passing day. They slept in snatches, huddled together for warmth, their sleep often interrupted by nightmares and the constant fear of discovery. After several days of arduous travel, they finally reached a small village, nestled in a valley, seemingly untouched by the war. They approached cautiously, observing the scene, searching for any sign of danger. The village seemed peaceful, the inhabitants going about their daily lives, seemingly oblivious to the conflict that raged beyond their borders. But Clara and Daniel knew that appearances could be deceiving, that the enemy could be lurking anywhere. They spotted a small post office, its windows boarded up, but a faint light flickering inside. They decided to take a chance. Daniel, his face pale and gaunt, his clothes torn and dirty, approached the post office, while Clara hid nearby, keeping watch. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. After a moment of agonizing silence, the door creaked open. An elderly woman, her face wrinkled and weary, peered out at him.
What do you want?
She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel, using a false name and a fabricated story, explained that he needed to send an urgent telegram to his family. He offered her money, a significant sum, hoping to bribe her into helping him. The woman hesitated for a moment, then, with a sigh of resignation, she agreed. She led him inside, to a small, dusty room, where an ancient telegraph machine sat on a table. Daniel, with Clara watching over his shoulder, carefully composed the message, using a prearranged code that only Mrs. Abernathy would understand. The black crow has flown. The weeping willow is withered. Seek shelter in the cathedral. Await the lullaby. It was a cryptic message, but it conveyed the essential information. They were in danger, their location was compromised, and they needed help. The cathedral was a code name for a safe house in Amiens, a place where they could hopefully find refuge. The woman sent the telegram, her hands trembling as she tapped out the message. She took Daniel's money, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. Go now, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And may God be with you. Clara and Daniel slipped away unnoticed, disappearing back into the shadows. They had taken a desperate gamble, entrusting their lives to a stranger, hoping that their message would reach Mrs. Abernathy, that she would be able to help them. They returned to the forest, finding a secluded spot to wait, their bodies exhausted, their spirits drained. They had done all they could. Now, they could only hope, pray, that their message had been received, that help was on its way. They knew that the cathedral, with its soaring arches and stained glass windows, symbolized hope, but they didn't know if it was enough. The weeping sky continued its relentless downpour. The echoes of the village were now replaced by the quiet drip of rain on leaves, a symphony of uncertainty and anticipation, played out against the backdrop of a world still at war. The desperate gamble had been made. Now, all they could do was wait. They had sent their plea into the void. Chapter 17. Flight through the night. Days turned into nights, each hour an eternity of waiting, of hoping, of fearing. Clara and Daniel, huddled together in their forest hideout, their bodies weak from hunger and exhaustion, their spirits slowly dwindling, began to lose hope. Had their message not reached Mrs. Abernathy? Had they been abandoned? Then, on the third night, as they were huddled together, trying to sleep, they heard it. A faint, distant sound, barely audible above the rustle of leaves and the gentle patter of rain. It was the sound of an engine, a familiar rumble that sent a jolt of adrenaline through their weary bodies. They listened intently, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound grew closer, louder, until it was unmistakable. It was the ambulance, the lullaby, coming to their rescue. They scrambled to their feet, their bodies aching, their minds racing. They emerged from the forest, onto a narrow, dirt road, their eyes scanning the darkness, searching for the source of the sound. Then they saw it. The headlights of the ambulance, cutting through the night like beacons of hope, approaching slowly, cautiously. It stopped a short distance from them, the engine idling softly. Mrs. Abernathy emerged, her face etched with relief and concern.
Clara.
Daniel. Thank God, you're alive. They rushed towards her, embracing her, their bodies trembling with emotion.
They were safe for now.
They had been found. They climbed into the ambulance, collapsing onto the seats, their bodies exhausted but their spirits soaring. Mrs. Abernathy quickly explained the situation. She had received their message, but it had taken her time to locate them, to navigate the treacherous roads, to avoid the enemy patrols.
We're heading to Amiens, she said.
To the cathedral. It's the safest place for you now. The journey to Amiens was fraught with tension. They drove through the night, the headlights dimmed, their senses on high alert for any sign of danger. They passed through deserted villages, their buildings dark and silent, their inhabitants hiding from the war. As they neared Amiens, the sounds of war became more intense. The distant rumble of artillery, the crackle of gunfire, the occasional roar of an airplane overhead, it was a constant reminder of the violence that surrounded them. They reached Amiens just before dawn, the city shrouded in a thick fog. They drove through the deserted streets, the buildings looming like ghostly shapes in the mist. They finally reached the cathedral, a massive, imposing structure, its spire piercing the sky like a prayer. Mrs. Abernathy parked the ambulance in a hidden alleyway behind the cathedral. They slipped inside, through a small, inconspicuous door, entering a world of hushed silence and soaring beauty. The cathedral was a sanctuary, a place of refuge from the storm. The high, vaulted ceilings, the stained glass windows, the flickering candles, it was a place of peace, of tranquility, a world away from the chaos and violence of the war. They were greeted by a priest, Father Michel, a kind-faced man with gentle eyes and a quiet demeanor. He was a member of the resistance, a trusted ally of Mrs. Abernathy, a man who had risked his life countless times to help those in need. He led them to a small, hidden chamber behind the altar, a secret room that had been used for centuries to shelter those fleeing persecution. It was a safe haven, a place where they could rest, recover, and plan their next move. Clara and Daniel, exhausted but safe, finally allowed themselves to relax, to breathe, to believe that they might actually survive this ordeal. They had been through so much, had faced so many dangers, but they had made it. They were together, and they were safe for now. The weeping sky had given way to a soft, gray dawn, filtering through the stained glass windows of the cathedral. The echoes of the forest were now replaced by the quiet murmur of prayers and the distant sounds of the city awakening, a symphony of hope and resilience, played out against the backdrop of a world still at war. The flight through the night had ended, but their journey was far from over. They had found sanctuary, but the enemy was still out there, still searching for them. They would need to remain vigilant, to trust in each other, to continue their fight for freedom, for love, for a future that, against all odds, they still believed in. Chapter 18. Sanctuary Found. The hidden chamber behind the altar of the Amiens Cathedral was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the sanctuary itself. It was small, damp, and sparsely furnished, with only a few cots, a table, and a flickering oil lamp. But to Clara and Daniel, it was a palace, a haven of safety and peace after their harrowing ordeal. Father Michel provided them with food, water, and clean clothes, tending to their needs with quiet efficiency and gentle compassion. He also brought news from the outside world, updates on the war, on the resistance, on the hunt for Dubois's allies. "They're still searching for you," he said, his voice grave. "Schmidt is relentless. He will not give up until he finds you." Clara and Daniel exchanged a worried look. They knew that their escape was only temporary, that their sanctuary was fragile, that the enemy was still out there, closing in. But for now, they allowed themselves to rest, to recover, to regain their strength. They slept for hours, their bodies exhausted, their minds slowly unwinding from the constant tension and fear. They also talked, sharing their experiences, their fears, their hopes for the future. They spoke of their love for each other, of their dreams of a life together, a life free from the shadows of war. Daniel, though still haunted by his past, began to show signs of healing. The nightmares were less frequent, the flashbacks less intense. He was still withdrawn at times, lost in his own thoughts, but he was also more present, more engaged, more like the man Clara had fallen in love with. Clara, too, was changing. The experience of the war, the constant threat of danger, the responsibility for Daniel's safety had made her stronger, more resilient, more determined. She had discovered a courage she never knew she possessed, a willingness to fight for what she believed in, for the people she loved. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of war, had deepened, matured. It was no longer just a passionate romance, a stolen embrace in the midst of chaos. It was a partnership, a bond of mutual trust and respect, a shared commitment to survival and to each other. One evening, as they were sitting together in the chamber, sharing a meager meal, Daniel took Clara's hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and gratitude. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "For everything. For saving my life, for believing in me, for never giving up on me." Clara squeezed his hand, her heart overflowing with emotion. "We saved each other, Daniel," she said. "We always will." Their sanctuary, however, was not without its limitations. They were confined to the small chamber, unable to venture outside, their days marked by the rhythm of the cathedral bells, their nights punctuated by the distant sounds of the war. They also knew that they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to find a way to escape, to reach safety, to start a new life, far from the reach of Schmidt and his allies. Father Michel, with the help of Mrs. Abernathy, who had remained in contact via the hidden radio, was working on a plan. It was a daring plan, a risky plan, but it was their only hope. They would be smuggled out of France across the English Channel, to England. It was a long and dangerous journey, fraught with peril, but it was their best chance for a future together, a future free from the shadows of war. The cathedral provided more than physical safety. The weeping sky had given way to a clear, starry night. The echoes of the city were now replaced by the quiet murmur of prayers and the soft strains of organ music, a symphony of hope and faith, played out against the backdrop of a world slowly beginning to heal. Sanctuary had been found, but the journey was far from over. They had found refuge in the heart of a war-torn city, but their escape was still a distant dream, a fragile hope that they clung to with all their strength. The plan was in motion, but the greatest risks lay ahead. Chapter 19. The Price of Freedom. The plan to smuggle Clara and Daniel out of France was intricate and perilous, relying on a network of resistance contacts, forged documents, and sheer luck. Mrs. Abernathy, using her connections and influence, had secured passage for them on a small fishing boat, scheduled to leave from a secluded cove on the coast of Normandy under the cover of darkness. Father Michel, meanwhile, had arranged for their transport from Amiens to the coast, a journey that would take them through enemy-occupied territory, past checkpoints and patrols. He had secured a vehicle, an old, nondescript delivery truck, and a driver, a young resistance fighter named Henri, who knew the back roads and hidden paths. The night of their departure arrived, cloaked in a thick fog that blanketed the city and the surrounding countryside. Clara and Daniel, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation, said goodbye to Father Michel, thanking him for his kindness, his courage, his unwavering support. "May God be with you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And may you find the peace and happiness you deserve." They climbed into the back of the truck, huddled together among crates of vegetables and sacks of flour, their bodies tense, their senses on high alert. Henri, a young man with a determined face and steady hands, started the engine, the sound muffled by the fog. The journey was a nerve-wracking ordeal. They drove slowly, cautiously, avoiding the main roads, sticking to narrow, winding tracks that were often little more than dirt paths. They passed through deserted villages, their buildings dark and silent, their inhabitants hiding from the war. They encountered several checkpoints, manned by wary German soldiers, but Henry's forged documents and calm demeanor saw them through. Each encounter, however, left them shaken, the threat of discovery ever present. As they neared the coast, the fog began to thin, revealing a sliver of moon in the inky sky. The sounds of the sea, the crashing of waves, the cries of seagulls, filled the air, a symphony of freedom and danger. They reached the designated cove, a small, secluded inlet hidden among rocky cliffs. The fishing boat, a small, battered vessel, bobbed gently in the water, its silhouette barely visible in the darkness. A man emerged from the shadows, a fisherman named Jacques, his face weathered and lined, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and determination. He was the captain of the boat, the man who would guide them across the treacherous waters of the English Channel. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low and gruff. Clara and Daniel nodded, their throats tight with emotion. They were ready. They had come this far, they would not turn back now. They climbed aboard the boat, their bodies trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. Henri wished them luck, his eyes filled with a silent understanding of the risks they were taking. The engine sputtered to life, the sound echoing across the water. The boat slowly pulled away from the shore, leaving behind the land of their birth, the land of their suffering, the land of their love. The journey across the channel was long and arduous. The sea was rough, the waves tossing the small boat like a toy. Clara and Daniel huddled together in the cramped cabin, their bodies cold and wet, their stomachs churning with seasickness. But they did not complain. They knew that this was the price of freedom, the cost of their escape, the final hurdle they had to overcome to reach safety, to start a new life. They were so close. Suddenly, a searchlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the boat, followed by the roar of a German patrol boat. They had been spotted.
"Get down!"
Jacques shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Clara and Daniel ducked for cover, their hearts pounding in their chests. The patrol boat approached rapidly, its guns trained on the fishing boat. A voice boomed across the water, ordering them to stop, to surrender. Jacques ignored the command, increasing the speed of the boat, trying to outrun the enemy. Gunfire erupted, bullets whizzing past their heads, splintering the wood of the cabin. The fishing boat shuddered, taking on water. Clara and Daniel clung to each other, their bodies trembling with fear. They were trapped, caught between the enemy and the sea, their hopes of escape seemingly dashed. It seemed their journey would end here, swallowed by the waves, another tragic casualty of the war. The price of freedom, it seemed, was too high. Chapter 20. Dawn of a New Beginning. The German patrol boat continued its relentless pursuit, its guns firing relentlessly at the smaller fishing vessel. Jacques, despite the danger, remained at the helm, skillfully maneuvering the boat through the treacherous waves, trying to evade the enemy fire. Clara and Daniel, huddled in the cramped cabin, their bodies trembling with fear, their hopes dwindling with each passing moment, prepared for the worst. They clung to each other, their love a fragile shield against the overwhelming forces arrayed against them. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the night. A roar, different from the patrol boat's engine, a sound that grew louder, closer, until it filled the sky. It was a British fighter plane, its silhouette appearing like an angel of mercy against the moonlit sky. It swooped down, firing its guns at the German patrol boat, its bullets finding their mark. The patrol boat, caught by surprise, was quickly disabled, its engine sputtering, its guns silenced. It began to list, smoke billowing from its damaged hull, sinking slowly beneath the waves. The British plane circled overhead, a protective guardian, ensuring that the fishing boat was safe. Jacques, his face etched with relief, waved his thanks to the pilot, his heart filled with gratitude. The danger had passed, but the journey was far from over. The fishing boat was badly damaged, taking on water rapidly. They were still miles from the English coast, their chances of survival slim. Jacques, his face grim, assessed the situation. "We're sinking," he said, his voice filled with resignation. "We won't make it to shore." Clara and Daniel exchanged a look, their hearts sinking with despair. They had come so far, had survived so much, only to face death in the cold, unforgiving waters of the English Channel. But Jacques, a seasoned sailor, refused to give up. He had a plan, a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to save their lives. He radioed for help, sending out a distress signal, hoping that anyone, would hear their plea. He then instructed Clara and Daniel to put on life vests, preparing them for the inevitable. They waited, huddled together on the deck, the waves crashing around them, the boat slowly sinking beneath their feet. They prayed, their voices barely audible above the roar of the sea, their hopes clinging to a fragile thread. Then they saw it. A light, in the distance, growing closer, brighter, until it illuminated the darkness like a beacon of hope. It was a British rescue boat, responding to their distress signal, coming to their aid. They had been found.
They were saved.
The rescue boat pulled alongside the sinking fishing vessel, its crew extending helping hands, pulling Clara, Daniel, and Jacques aboard. They were safe at last. They had made it. They were taken to a nearby port, where they were greeted by British officials, medical personnel, and representatives of the resistance. They were given warm clothes, food, and medical attention, their bodies and spirits slowly recovering from their harrowing ordeal. Daniel's past, however, was not so easily erased. They were questioned, interrogated, their stories verified, their identities confirmed. Dubois's confession, which Clara had managed to keep safe throughout their escape, played a crucial role in clearing Daniel's name, in proving his loyalty, in exposing the network of spies that had operated within the French hospital. After weeks of uncertainty, they were finally granted asylum in England, given new identities, and offered a chance to start a new life, far from the shadows of the war. They settled in a small, quiet village in the countryside, their past a closely guarded secret, their future filled with both hope and uncertainty. They had survived the war, but the scars, both visible and invisible, remained, a constant reminder of the price they had paid for freedom. The journey had been brutal, but the destination was a new life. As the sun rose, painting the sky with colors of gold and pink, Clara and Daniel stood hand in hand, looking out over the rolling hills of their new home. The weeping sky had finally given way to a clear, bright dawn, a dawn of a new beginning. The echoes of the war were now replaced by the sounds of birdsong and the gentle breeze, a symphony of peace and hope, played out against the backdrop of a world slowly beginning to heal. The price of freedom had been high, but they had paid it together. And now they were free. Free to love, free to live, free to build a future where the horrors of war would be replaced by the promise of peace, a future they would face together, hand in hand, heart to heart. The sunrise was not just the start of a day, it was the dawn they had fought so hard to reach. Epilogue. Years passed, turning into decades. The scars of war, though faded, remained, etched on their bodies and their souls, a constant reminder of the journey they had undertaken, the price they had paid for freedom. Clara and Daniel built a life together in their quiet village, their love a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in a world scarred by conflict. They never forgot the people who had helped them along the way. Mrs. Abernathy, who had risked her life to save them, Father Michel, who had sheltered them in the heart of a war-torn city, Jean-Luc and Marie, who had offered them sanctuary on their farm, even Jacques, the fisherman who had braved the treacherous waters of the English Channel. These were the unsung heroes of their story, the individuals who had embodied courage, compassion, and unwavering loyalty. Daniel, though forever changed by his experiences, found a measure of peace in his new life. He worked as a teacher, sharing his love of literature with generations of students, instilling in them the values of empathy, understanding, and the importance of fighting for what is right. Clara, too, found her purpose. She continued her work as a nurse, caring for the sick and the wounded, her compassion deepened by her own experiences, her touch imbued with a healing power that went beyond mere medicine. They had children, and then grandchildren, their family a living testament to their enduring love, a symbol of the future they had fought so hard to achieve. They told their children stories, not of the war, but of the courage and kindness they had witnessed, of the people who had helped them, of the love that had sustained them through the darkest of times. They often returned to France, visiting the places that held such significance for them. The hospital where they had first met, the ruined tavern of Le Corbeau Noir, the farm of Jean-Luc and Marie who had survived the war, their bravery a legend in the local community, and the cathedral in Amiens, where they had found sanctuary and hope. Each visit was a bittersweet pilgrimage, a journey back in time, a reminder of the horrors they had endured, but also of the strength they had found in each other, of the love that had blossomed in the midst of chaos and destruction. One autumn evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the rolling hills of their adopted homeland, Daniel took Clara's hand, his touch still gentle, still filled with the love that had sustained them through the years. "We made it, Clara," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and peace. "We found our dawn." Clara squeezed his hand, her heart overflowing with emotion. "Yes, Daniel," she said. "We did." The weeping sky had long since dried its tears. The echoes of war had faded into the distant past. The scars remained, but they were no longer a source of pain, but a reminder of their resilience, of their courage, of their enduring love. They had found their peace, their happiness, their future. And they had found it together. The dawn had broken, not just once, but every day of their long and loving life together, a testament to the power of hope, the strength of the human spirit, and the enduring beauty of a love that had conquered all. The sun dipped below the horizon, and a new beginning matured into its enduring legacy. The end.